Hi folks, hope you're okay today. It's good to be with you. I want to talk about historical Jesus studies and scholarship. I read a PhD on historical Jesus studies last week, and what surprised me as I was looking, as I was reading the PhD, was looking at historical method in historical Jesus study writing. So it was looking at main hitters like Mayer, Dominic Crossan, and Dale Allison, N.T. Wright, and many, many more historical Jesus scholars, Sanders, and the PhD was looking at the criteria, the methodology that these scholars use, and assessing the criteria and the methodology. What I found interesting is there was no basic objective criteria that the scholars were actually using. What they were doing is they were using criteria, so for example the criteria of multiple attestation, the criteria of dissimilarity, and there are many other criteria, and scholars were taking various criteria and interpreting that criteria in different ways, and also putting criteria with other criteria in different combinations and emphasis as opposed to another scholar. So the top and bottom of it is that we have a multifaceted and multi-layered scholarship on historical Jesus studies around the world in the West today, and really a lot of it is not objective, really it's theory based and subjective and arbitrary. Now many scholars might disagree with this. They might say, well, no, I've mentioned my methodology, I'm trying to be objective, and you'll find that many of the historical Jesus scholars will try to present themselves as being objective, but when you actually scratch under the surface and you actually look at the actual methodologies that they're using, the criteria that they're using, it's very often not the same as a fellow colleague. They will interpret a criteria in a different way, they'll apply a criteria in a different way, and they'll have a different variety of combinations of criteria from, say, a different scholar. So, for example, Dominic Crossan will use set criteria, but then he will also use the social sciences, anthropology, and he'll use various theories in sociology for his methodology in understanding the historical material. So there's a whole raft of a different way of tackling topics than, say, N.T. Wright or Dale Allison. So basically, a couple of things that we need to say here, that if you're a Christian and you hear at college or university or your professor attacking Christianity, saying this scholar says this and this scholar says that, and assured results of scholarship say this, remember that 99.9% likely that what your professor's saying is just hogwash, that it's really subjective arbitrariness going on in the academic institutions. Alright? So don't be afraid of what your professor says. Secondly, whenever the culture, the news, or whatever start to bambish whatever scholarship is being pumped out of the academy, don't be intimidated by it. A lot of it, 99% of it, is going to be arbitrary, subjective nonsense. Thirdly, if you're a Christian scholar, you need to work on developing more objective criteria in your methodology, in your methodologies of whatever you're doing, whether it's historical Jesus studies or whether it be exegesis or whatever. You need to try and work on more objective criteria. And secondly, you need to think about working on a Christian worldview, because whatever your worldview is, your criteria is not going to matter anyway, because the criteria that you have, whatever information you're going to get from that criteria, you're still going to interpret according to the presuppositions that you have. So if I'm a Dominic Crossan, you will read the material from a sociological, anthropological framework. If you are an NT Wright, you'll read it from a post-Israel framework. If you, etc., etc. So you need to develop a Christian worldview of doing historiography. For example, prior to the Enlightenment, history was seen as a history of salvation. It was seen from a Christian perspective as a history of salvation. Then in the Enlightenment, the understanding of history changed to a history of secularism, where the Enlightenment taught about the progress of man. And now we're in a time of postmodernism, where there's a battle between the modernist and the postmodernist. There's been a backlash by the modernist historians, and in the midst of this intellectual convulsion, we need to, as Christians, come back to what is a Christian understanding of history, a Christian interpretation of history, a Christian way of dealing with history. And there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of thought that needs to go into that. And I think there's strategic thinking in the area of history and the philosophy of history. If you look at the great intellectuals in the West, like St. Augustine, Hegel, Marx, etc., they were great philosophers of history, and you can never really have any intellectual weight or any intellectual power in your writing, in your thinking, in your scholarship, unless you've got a philosophy of history. And sadly, Christians have given up a Christian philosophy of history, and we need to bring that back more. We need to think about that more. We need to write about that more. There needs to be a lot more academic philosophical books written by Christian academic philosophers on the philosophy of history from a Christian point of view. We need to also push on a scientific level the Christian history, the Christian position in the philosophy of history. In the area of science, push it back in the area of evolution. And we also need to bring it into historiography itself. So there's a lot of work there for academic philosophers, sociologists, psychologists, and Christian intellectuals to write much on the philosophy of history, and to also for the Christian historians to begin to work more on objective criteria, and also to be more principled in not being afraid to talk about a Christian worldview of history, and how does that differ from secularist or postmodernist or modernist or even Islamic or any other kind of history, such as feminist history, queer history, etc. Those are my thoughts from reading this PhD. I hope this stimulates any academic out there to think about what I've just said. Alright, God bless you and take care. I would encourage you as a start to read St. Augustine's City of God, because that is a book on the philosophy of history. And many Christian thinkers read that book and be inspired to carry on the work that Augustine was trying to do there. God bless you.